Hello, my name is Marisol Perez, and I will be speaking about student-centered learning, which I will refer to as SCL in the PowerPoint, and how it can be linked to 21st century skills. As the learning event, I will make recommendations for the AP Spanish teacher to implement this approach. My question is, how do AP Spanish teachers create opportunities that are student-centered without compromising the skills needed for the AP Spanish test? The ideas behind SCL stem from a constructivist belief where students are given the opportunity to learn by doing. With the constructivist view as the basis, students are exposed to real life scenarios in which to learn by doing. While situated in a real life application of this information, students are answering their own question: why do we need to know this? By engaging in situational learning, students begin to process the information not as a concept simply to be learned, but as a concept that is learned, practiced, and applied. This approach relies on metacognition and pushes students to reflect upon their own learning as they grapple with new information. Students in this approach must be motivated to improve personally, to solve problems, and to gain understanding. This is not the classroom where the teacher provides all of the answers and students are passive learners. Although SCL proposes to put the responsibility for learning on the student, the approach requires both student and teacher to move away from traditional forms of instruction. SCL requires students to be more accountable for their own learning, but requires the teacher to facilitate the learning. It does not imply that students receive tasks to complete without support or guidance in the learning process. SCL requires students to play a more active role in their learning, but requires the teacher to promote active learning in the classroom. It does not mean simply engaging in games, although games could be beneficial at times, but the activity should involve a real-life application of said knowledge. SCL requires students to learn from asking questions, but requires the teacher to reflect upon the questions that are posed to see where the level of comprehension is for the students. Questions serve as ways to gauge progress. SCL requires students to work in collaborative groups while the teacher scaffolds, monitors discussions, and checks for progress. In SCL, both teacher and student need to be motivated to engage in student-centered learning even when the process is difficult. Finally, both student and teacher must have self-efficacy, which is the belief in themselves. SCL gives teachers an opportunity to fulfill the goals of one of the New Jersey student learning standards, which is to integrate 21st century life and career skills across the K-12 curriculum. The 21st century skills are outlined as collaboration, digital literacy, critical thinking, and problem solving, all skills that can be combined and nurtured in a student-centered learning environment. The SCL approach requires that students possess background knowledge, and I have included a form of scaffolding in an AP Spanish classroom that would ultimately end with students writing a persuasive essay. The persuasive essay prompt requires students to read two written sources and listen to one news source, with the expectation that students will use all three sources to support their stance on the persuasive prompt. Since students are unable to write effectively in the target language without prior grammar knowledge, and the SCL approach requires them to possess background knowledge, the AP Spanish teacher must create opportunities for review of different grammar points to aid students in writing, as well as numerous opportunities for students to use Spanish language without penalties. The course requires a sophisticated manipulation of the language as demonstrated in the task of writing a persuasive essay, answering a specific question, using two written sources and one oral source in Spanish. In order to help students with this enormous task, the teacher must scaffold the learning as suggested by SCL. The teacher must aid students in attaining self-efficacy. Rather than overwhelm students with the task, the teacher might start with exposing students to current events on the topic and having students explore answers and share viewpoints. The teacher could have a debate requesting that students defend their stances before reading the sources contained in the essay prompt. Once the students have had an opportunity to discuss the topic, Then the teacher could perhaps require students to gather sources that support one side or the other. Using these sources, the teacher could organize students to have a discussion about best practices to extrapolate the information that would be necessary to support an answer. Then, as a follow up, give students the opportunity to read new sources and have them create an argument for their stance. Finally, have individual discussions with students or groups, giving the students an opportunity to explain their essay structure. The instructor will make recommendations to further guide students. By allowing students to practice the necessary steps prior to completing the entire task helps the student feel safe and willing to take risks in the classroom, something that student-centered learning requires. In conclusion, teachers must be willing to give up some control in the classroom. Students must be willing to be responsible with that control. Teachers must be willing to allow students the opportunity to question. Students must be willing to ask questions. Teachers must be willing to create real-life scenarios in the classroom. Students must be willing to participate in real-life scenarios. Teachers and students must be willing to put forth the time to engage in student-centered learning. SCL is not easier than the traditional approaches to instruction, but do have many more benefits for students as they acquire the necessary knowledge to make them globally competitive. Attached are my references. I thank you for your time and I look forward to your presentations. Thank you.